Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining me for this video. Today's topic is Eastern Tennessee between the years of 1770 and 1790. If you are researching your ancestors who were living in this area during this time period, you are researching individuals who were free-spirited, who sought adventures, who wanted to establish and settle on land that had never been established or settled before. Many of these early families arrived from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina for the most part, and they settled along three major water routes, namely the Nolichucky River, Holston River, and Watauga River. Once they arrived with their families and friends, they would establish their houses, and they would work out trade agreements and treaty agreements with the local Native American Indian tribes, namely the Cherokee Indian and the Catawba Indians. These negotiations guided them through their experiences of daily life and allowed them to prosper and farm their land. In the meantime, they organized themselves together. They would meet together in each other's homes. They would hold religious services. They would also hold family gatherings, parties, harvesting of crops, and they would erect forts along various different smaller waterways. Forts could be seen all throughout eastern Tennessee during this time period. Whenever negotiations went downward with the Native American Indians, then various families would gather together and they would seek security within the walls of these forts. This was the experiences that these families felt during this time period. They were far away from what people would consider as civilized in daily lives. They were living on the frontier. They would shoot wild game for their food and raise their own crops and chop wood for their fuel and to warm themselves during a winter's fire. And they pretty much got along with one another. If someone got out of hand, then they would meet together as a group and decide what punishments, if any, would need to be handed out. They were very well organized. Oftentimes attacks would occur and refuge was sought through the fort walls. And at times settlers were killed during these ambushes and skirmishes. As family members died, oftentimes these early families would bury their family members in unrecognized graves. This was done for a reason. They did not want the local Native American Indians to be able to locate their dead family member. One particular case that quickly comes to mind as I'm discussing this with you guys is John Severe's first wife. She had just recently given birth to her daughter, and they immediately received word that a possible Indian attack could occur the next morning. They quickly gathered all of their children together, a few personal belongings, and they sought refuge inside the fort that was closest to them. During the night, his first wife passed away and she died. They buried her in the middle of the night, as one description recorded it by the light of the moon. As the funeral service was being carried out, a thunderstorm came upon them and it began to rain. And it was recorded that John Severe stood at the graveside of his wife, holding his infant daughter, so that his infant daughter could attend the funeral service. They buried his wife without any markings, and this was in hopes that the Native American Indians who were around them would not discover the recent grave. They covered it with branches and laurel bushes and vines to disguise it. This was life for these settlers. They had good times and they had bad times, but they all shared it together. So when word of the American Revolutionary War came about, they were quickly aroused, and as oftentimes they would have individual militia units that they had organized themselves and they had nominated leaders in all of this. So they organized again for the onset of the American Revolutionary War. They were excited to think that they may have an opportunity to create a new nation, and they would finally be recognized for their lands and what they stood for. So they were eager to march to Kings Mountain in the year 1780, and they greatly participated in this battle. Many lost their lives, and as many family historians will proclaim, that this particular battle changed the war, and it turned the tides of the war. I, on a personal opinion, have always felt that the South's participation during the American Revolutionary War won the American Revolutionary War. Due to all of the many families who migrated down the Great Wagon Road and participated in all of the skirmishes and battles that occurred in this areas in South Carolina and North Carolina and into Virginia. Yes, I think they actually won the American Revolutionary War. After Kings Mountain, the Eastern Tennessee family members who survived were eager to return home. At the closure of the war, North Carolina decided we no longer want to hold control over the lands in Eastern Tennessee. They are too far out away from us. Their demands are too great, and they're an organized people. They don't want to pay taxes. They're ruthless. They have their own set of ideas. We want to relinquish these lands and return them back to Congress. And that's what North Carolina did. But please keep in mind that North Carolina, along with all of the other original 13 colonies now becoming states, acquired a great deal of debt. Each debt was divided after the war had ended. Each of these debts amounts were divided per state. And North Carolina was responsible for quite a huge deal, a huge amount. So relinquishing Tennessee, they were hoping to maybe downsize the amount of debt that they owned. The debts were also allocated to the size of the newly acquired state. Congress, once they received this request, they decided, okay, we'll take this in consideration, but things will stand as they are for 1 year. And so that's the way it was. But North Carolina offered, the higher delegates and headed officials offered no or little support to the individual families that were living along in Eastern Tennessee during this time. Eastern Tennessee was still being attacked by the Native American Indians, who now felt threatened at the closure of the American Revolutionary War because they had sided with the British. The British was constantly sending them guns and supplies and beads and all kinds of trading tactics that were used by the British during the American Revolutionary War that ceased at times. But sometimes the British were still coming up through Mississippi and still dealing with these Native Americans. So it was causing a big controversy between the Eastern Tennessee families and the Cherokee and the Catawba Indians. So attacks were frequent. Many letters were transmitted back and forth between head officials of North Carolina and the participants and the families of living in Eastern Tennessee, requesting military aid and requesting supplies, requesting aid, requesting assistance of securing forts. Very little assistance was given. But this did not discourage or make the Eastern Tennessee families, make them feel like they needed to leave the area. They were there to stay. And what did? They organized themselves again. And they created a proposal for the state of Franklin. If we can't be part of North Carolina, and if North Carolina will not hear our voice, then maybe this new nation in Congress will hear our voice, and we will become our own state. In the meantime, North Carolina created an act called the Land Grant the Land Grab Act of 1783. What is a Land Grab Act? It's literally what it sounds like. Individuals were allowed to go to western lands of North Carolina and within their boundaries, state boundaries, and grab land. You were allowed to go to one particular land office, record your land. Many of these titles that were recorded were fictitious and false, giving little information about what the actual land, where it was located, what the actual boundaries were, and so forth. The only stipulation through the Land Grab Act was that you could not acquire or lay title to over 5,000 acres. That was the only stipulation. Who participated in this Land Grab Act? All of your newly elected head officials in North Carolina. Once these head officials caught word and found out that the Eastern Tennessee families had organized the state of Franklin and submitted in a proposal to Congress, they became very furious for several reasons. But the number one main reason why they became furious is they realized that the newly acquired land titles that they had just recorded may not be recognized by a new state if that new state was recognized. So North Carolina quickly put their foot down and said, no, we are going to support these Eastern Tennessee families, and we're going not to send them military aid. We're going to assist them in road building. We're going to assist them in the waterways trade that they requested, creating trade down through the various rivers, through the Mississippi River for trade. And we're going to assist them with supplies and fortifying their forts. We're going to send military aid, and we're going to name a person in charge of all of this. We're going to establish boundary county lines and create a county. And let's call it Washington County in honor of George Washington. And so they did. And they created the boundaries of Washington County. Washington County was established. They sent supplies to fortify the forts. They also sent military aid, and they named John Sevier as the commanding officer. John Sevier was also the president recognized on the General Committee that proposed the state of Franklin. North Carolina was trying to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak, by doing this. They thought that by selecting John Sevier as the head commander, that any proposals of seeking statehood under the name of Franklin would cease. But this didn't happen. Overall, the end of the story, the state of Franklin did not occur. But a new state did, and it was Tennessee. And I think that's what all of these Eastern Tennessee families were striving for. They were striving for a political voice to be heard. They wanted to be recognized for a people who took it upon themselves to travel to a wilderness frontier, negotiated with the American Native Indians, and at times they were in conflict, but for the most part, they lived together. And they survived. And I think that stands for much more than words can express. So, if you have ancestors who live in Eastern Tennessee, you are researching a people who were free-spirited, loved adventure, and had many dreams for the future. I have recently posted and written several articles about the state of Franklin on PiedmontTrails.com. And if you would like to know more details about what exactly happened with the events leading up to the state of Franklin and what was the state of Franklin's demise, I urge you to go to PiedmontTrails.com and read those articles. Also, if you are a family historian and you are researching in this particular area, you may not know that I recently released a podcast during the first of this month in May of 2020. This podcast I shared over 70 resources, genealogical resources that are free to use that are only specific for this particular area. And I will post a link to that podcast at the end of this video. I'm going to end it here. And if you have any comments or suggestions, or if you would like to share your family's history with me, let me know. And I hope to have more about Eastern Tennessee with this series coming up soon. We'll see how it goes. The most important thing is this: enjoy your journey. And your journey to the past at times can be frustrating and disappointing, and can be filled with long nights of finding very little or nothing. But take time out to take in the scenery of genealogy too, and browse around you, and take a long breath and take it all in, and enjoy your journey to the past. That's the most important. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Have a great day.